So we've already talked about that one difference regarding puberty, no matter where you live, whether in a modernized, westernized culture or a traditional culture, is that puberty has an agreed upon starting point for girls with her first menstruation, whereas for boys, the beginning of puberty is not exact. It's not inevitable. Recognition of manhood has to be something that is achieved. Whereas for girls, womanhood is in fact inevitable because of these biological changes. I want you to really think about that for a minute. As a female, you will inevitably, certainly become a woman. It just happens. Nobody questions that it's going to happen. When you start menstruating in traditional cultures, you are considered a woman. But for a male, it is not inevitable. Becoming a man is not just an inevitable part of natural development. You have to demonstrate it in some ways. And think about it, as indicated in your textbook, some cultures have a term in their language to describe a male who is considered to be a failed man, not a full man, but there's no similar terms for a woman. So what does a boy have to do to be considered a man in a traditional culture to achieve manhood and not be considered a failed man? Well, David Gilmour published a book about this called Manhood in the Making: Cultural Concepts of Masculinity. He's an anthropologist at the State University of New York, and he's authored several books. In this book, he takes a cross-cultural approach to studying masculinity, meaning he looks at various cultures and how they regard this specific topic. He found that in all traditional cultures, there tends to be an emphasis on what we would consider stereotypical traits of manliness. So, being tough, being aggressive, being a very sexual person. And he looked at ideals of manhood in places like Japan, India, China, the Mediterranean, Aboriginal South America, ancient Greece, and yes, modern North America as well. He said that in most traditional cultures, boys are required to demonstrate three things before they are considered a man: that they can provide, that they can protect, and that they can procreate. Now, these pictures are going to be of the Mahanaku tribe in Brazil, and I'm going to talk about them in detail in a moment. So, the first requirement to be considered a man is to prove that you can provide, that he can provide for himself and thus provide for a future wife or family. And what he needs to do to prove he can provide depends on the exact society or culture that we're looking at. Maybe it's hunting, maybe it's fishing, maybe it's trapping. Gilmour said that in order to be considered a full man, an adolescent boy must prove that he can protect. To protect himself, again, to protect a future wife and children, to provide protection for his society wherever he is. So that might mean developing skills with a particular weapon. It might mean developing skills with a particular kind of warfare. And he must prove that he can procreate, that he can function sexually well enough to produce children. So this means, of course, that he must have some kind of sexual experience before marriage, or else this would be in doubt. So in general, these are the three main requirements in a traditional culture for an adolescent boy to be considered a man. But I want you to recognize that in these three specific needs, there are other things embedded in them as well. So if somebody is learning to provide, it means he has to be persistent. He has to be determined. So those qualities are part of learning to provide. Learning to protect means he must have a certain amount of confidence. Again, he must have a certain amount of skill. He's learned it, he's persistent, and he must have a certain amount of courage. Even in proving that he can procreate, that necessarily includes demonstrating that he's sure of himself. So all of these personality traits are embedded in various ways in what appear to be three simple requirements. In his book, Gilmour provides specific examples of all of these. And as I said, one particular group he studies were the Mehinaku tribe, who are an indigenous tribe in Brazil. They live in the largest rainforest in Brazil, very, very remote area, and it's so remote it's been largely unaffected by developments elsewhere in the world, except for an occasional anthropologist who stumbles upon them. Now, their numbers are very small. For example, in 2011, their population only numbered 254. And just as an interesting side note, in this tribe, privacy has no value. So in a few minutes, you're going to see a picture of what a typical village looks like, and it's very large huts. Each hut houses 10 to 12 families. But in these huts, there are no internal walls. It's just one open area. This tribe is very, very specific in how it encourages socialization of children, not just male children, but female as well. And by the time a child is 3, they're usually cared for by an older sister as the norm. In their games, they pretend to be shamans and chiefs and husbands and wives, and sometimes they'll even pretend to be an extramarital lover. Just like kids here might pretend to be a mummy or a daddy or a nurse or a doctor or a construction worker, children in the tribe pretend to be what they will be as adults. They're replicating what they will be as an adult. Now, adolescent males in this tribe, learning to provide means learning to fish and hunt, two main activities of the males. Depending on the food supply, fishing and hunting might involve going on long trips elsewhere, maybe a couple days, maybe even a couple weeks at a time. So yeah, learning to provide means learning to provide, but it also means having the courage to go on these trips and perseverance because it takes a lot of effort and patience. And of course, physical strength. In this tribe, protection means learning to handle their weapons and being prepared to fight neighboring tribes. So they are peaceful themselves, but sometimes they're in a position where they have to defend themselves. So, and in addition, on these fishing and hunting trips, when they're gone for weeks at a time, they might have to defend themselves on these trips. So they prepare to be able to defend themselves in some ways by wrestling with each other every day. Not just for fun, but boys and men will wrestle in very, very competitive matches. In fact, even the way the villages are organized take this into account. So every one of these large huts is built in such a way that the back of them face the center of the village. And in the afternoons and beginning of the evening, women will sit at the back of the huts to watch where these wrestling matches take place. So they check each other for ticks and they watch the wrestling matches. And of course, whoever wins is going to really raise their status, and whoever loses is going to lose a certain amount of status. So these daily wrestling matches really are considered a true indication of the status of a person's manhood. And clearly, as an adolescent boy, this is going to create a lot of pressure for you. Because if they don't do well in the wrestling matches, then you're perceived to not be ready to be considered a real man. Now, how does this tribe handle procreation? Well, on one hand, it's a very popular topic of discussion. In this tribe, gossip is the norm and gossip takes place all the time. So if somebody fails to perform sexually, this information is going to make the rounds very, very quickly. It's going to become public knowledge as it's passed from one person to another. Because of this, any sexual difficulties on the part of a male are taken very, very seriously. Even the thought that something might happen. The men in the tribe may rub various plants or animal products on their penis to make sure they don't have a problem. So males in this tribe are under a lot of pressure to demonstrate that they can perform sexually on a regular basis. And if not, they're teased, they're ridiculed, and their status becomes very, very low. And to add to this pressure, in the tribe, they speak very, very openly about all aspects of all sexual relationships. All or almost all, adults are what we would consider married, but at the same time, most of them engage in many extramarital relations, which they all find very funny. Now, another aspect of the tribal culture that's relevant to this discussion is that gender roles are very rigidly defined in terms of who you spend your time with, even as an adult. So the village has what's known as the men's house. It's kind of like a clubhouse or a temple for the men in the tribe. Um, and it's only for men. Women are strictly forbidden from entering it. Men may hang out there, they may work on things there, and not only are women not permitted inside, they are absolutely forbidden, especially since in this men's hut are some objects that females are not allowed to touch, and some they're not even allowed to see that are related to certain rituals. If a woman should be found inside, or if she should touch any of these sacred objects, she may be subject to sexual assault by several members of the tribe as punishment. At the men's house and around the village, men and adolescent boys spend their time with each other. So as young boys, they don't spend their time with their mothers. And even when they're married, they're expected to spend most of their time with other men, not with their wives. In fact, when a man is married, after he and his wife have had several children, he can even have his own hut if he wants to. He can move into another one. He's still married, he's still a father, everything's still considered okay. But if he wants more space, that's completely fine. And even if he spends too much time with his wife, that's considered very negatively. That's considered a sign that he's not a real man. So these three themes of providing, protecting, and procreating can be seen clearly in adolescent boys' gender socialization among the Mihinaku. And this also demonstrates the really intense gender intensification hypothesis that often exists for adolescent boys in traditional cultures. Now, I want to speak for a moment about circumcision. Circumcision has occurred for both males and females for thousands of years. We know that it occurred in the Middle East, or what is now the Middle East, at least that long ago. For example, many people of the Jewish faith then and now. For them, circumcision has great religious significance, great community significance. It's perceived to be a sign of the covenant between God and the Jewish people. And in the Jewish community, circumcision is supposed to occur in infancy, 8 days after birth. Now, for others who have their male infants circumcised now in North America, it's perceived to be for hygienic reasons, a way to prevent certain diseases that are more likely to develop in uncircumcised males. In Western societies, it is now recognized that with current hygiene practices, it's no longer necessary for this reason. And there's actually been a very large and consistent swing, culturally speaking, to not circumcising male infants in North America because there is simply no need for it. If parents keep his genitalia clean when they're young, it's not a big deal for the boy to do it himself as he gets older. So what this means then is that circumcising a male child when it does occur is done for purely cultural reasons. There's no longer a medical need for it. We tend not to think of it that way, but at this point in history, with our ability to practice good hygiene, it is in fact cultural. In several parts of the world, circumcision occurs not in infancy but in adolescence, and not just among boys but girls as well. Cultures with adolescent circumcision exist in the Middle East but are most prevalent in Africa. But the nature of it and the consequences of circumcision are very different for boys and girls. Male adolescent circumcision typically involves cutting away the foreskin of the penis, which is intensely painful, and this is usually done with no anesthetic of any kind. In fact, the boys will be expected to demonstrate their courage and their readiness for manhood by not demonstrating any kind of effect from the pain. It's also typical for it to occur as part of a public ritual, observed by the community. So if a boy should demonstrate that he's feeling pain, this will be considered very negative for him. But the physical effects of male circumcision are not harmful in the long run or immediately, because once the cut heals, boys are still capable of urinating with no difficulty. And when they get older, they can experience pleasure from sexual activities, just as they would have before the circumcision. So they have no lingering negative effects. And they have the added bonus that going through this indicates they're ready for manhood and they're perceived and treated differently by the people around them. For adolescent girls, it is very, very, very different. Different in terms of the procedure and the possible consequences, both immediately and long term. There are actually different kinds of female circumcision, and the exact procedure will vary according to the country where it happens and who performs it. But it nearly always involves the clitoris, where female sexual sensation is concentrated. In some cultures, the hood of the clitoris is cut off. In some, the entire clitoris is cut off. The World Health Organization estimates that about 140 million girls and women have experienced this worldwide, mostly in countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And in the cultures where this is practiced, it is highly, highly entrenched. It is not viewed as odd as any way, and it's not viewed as harmful in any way. Now, female circumcision is not usually performed publicly. There may be several people there, but it's not performed publicly. And girls are not expected to not show any kind of pain. But the potential physical consequences for girls, both immediately and long term, are much more severe. It's usually carried out by women in the community, referred to as a traditional cutter, and not necessarily in any kind of sanitized, sterile environment. It can be done with or without anesthesia, often without. In some of the countries where this is done, a traditional cutter may literally be somebody in a hut with a razor blade or a piece of metal or a sharpened piece of glass, and it'll be used on several girls without being sanitized in between. Now, the question we typically ask as Westerners is, why? Even if we're trying not to be ethnocentric and we're trying not to judge somebody else's culture by the standards of our own, we can't help but throw our hands up and ask why. Well, first of all, in these countries, it's considered a traditional rite of passage, and it's considered something that beautifies women. Growing up in this kind of culture as a female, you know if you ever expect to be married and have children, this has to be done. Because marrying a girl that is uncircumcised is simply not done. And even mothers and grandmothers and aunts will insist that this is done. So it's not just the male people in these cultures, it's the females as well. In order to be socially acceptable, their daughter must have it done. And I mean, in all cultures, we generally grow up believing that our culture is good. And what we believe is the right thing to believe, that what we do is the right thing to do. And we rarely question the origins of it, the foundations of it. So culture carries with it a certain amount of inertia, doesn't it? A certain amount of momentum, a certain amount of automatic acceptance and apathy. It's the way it is because that's the way it is. And this is another reason behind the continued existence of female circumcision. It's always been that way. It's simply the way it is. Now, one theory is that males support the practice because it lowers a woman's enjoyment from sexual activity, making it much less likely she will ever be unfaithful to her eventual husband. And it prevents promiscuity between marriage as well. It would help to protect her modesty and her purity. So it's theorized that female circumcision is one way for men to exercise control over women's sexuality. And this is why it occurs in cultures where women typically have fewer rights than in other places. It's argued that female circumcision will help protect girls from rape, since until the opening that is left is widened, sexual intercourse is simply not possible. Now, in more recent years, this has become a very controversial issue globally speaking. And globally speaking, it's referred to as female genital mutilation, FGM, not female circumcision, because outside of these cultures, that is how we perceive it, as physical mutilation with no basis for it. International organizations have created huge campaigns against it. UNICEF, World Health Organization, United Nations. But countries and cultures where it continues to be performed, where it's commonplace, will strongly argue that this belief that there's a potential for long-term harm for women is greatly exaggerated. If you oppose it, you're being ethnocentric, you're trying to make our culture like yours. You shouldn't try to impose your values and your ways of life on us. Organizations who oppose it, who actively take steps to try to stop it, say, we understand your concerns about being ethnocentric, but when a practice causes such extreme suffering, the only thing to do is to try to stop it. As a result of a woman being circumcised in this manner, there can be a great deal of bleeding at the time, recurrent infections. From then on, for the rest of her life, she may have difficulty urinating or passing menstrual flow. She may have chronic pain every time she menstruates, or even every time she urinates. If it's really done incorrectly, it may affect her ability to hold urine in her bladder, so that she will continuously leak urine every day for the rest of her life uncontrollably. There's a heightened risk of urinary infections. She may develop cysts. She may be actually unable to get pregnant. And for those who do become pregnant, the risk of childbirth complications may also be heightened. And as I already said, female circumcision makes sexual intercourse less pleasurable for a woman, something males don't have to deal with. Just as there are no longer any known health benefits to male circumcision, there are no known health benefits to female circumcision. And it's actually been outlawed, or at least restricted, even in many of the countries where it's still commonly practiced, but it's not enforced. And for some people, it just boils down to the feeling that people have the right to do what they want to do. Now, this does make the news periodically here in Canada when people have come to Canada from another country who want to continue to practice this here, even though Canadian values and Canadian culture do not support it. The Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada very clearly state the practice has no known health benefits and can lead to serious, immediate, and life-threatening health risks. Now, as Canadian immigration policies have changed, more and more women from these countries have become permanent residents. So in Canada, for example, just in 2011, almost 29,000 people arrived here from Africa, a high percentage of which would have already undergone female circumcision in their home country as the cultural norm. And as women of reproductive age immigrate to Canada in great numbers, Canadian health professionals are faced with more and more requests for procedures involving genital cutting or for treatment due to a procedure they were subjected to in the past that has caused health problems. For example, in one article I found, a doctor recalled examining a pregnant immigrant in Canada who had undergone female circumcision in her home country. And in order to have the baby, the woman had to be defibrillated, which essentially means her vagina fully reopened. So the doctor did this to ensure maternal health and infant health. But the doctor then saw the woman again when she became pregnant a second time and was shocked to discover the woman had been re-infibulated. She had been sewn up again. And when questioned, because of course doing this is illegal in Canada, the woman admitted she had gone back to the African country she had come from to have it done, because to her it was normal. Women who undergo this form of female circumcision often are re-infibulated after giving birth. So it's not just an issue in terms of what actually occurs in other countries or other cultures, as some immigrants will travel back to their original countries to have the procedure performed on themselves, either voluntarily or because they are pressured to by their families. Or they will take their daughters back to their original countries to have it done, often against the will of the girls, who have become Americanized and no longer see the practice as normal. And this has raised the question of whether Canada should legally ban people from doing this. And if they do, they either cannot re-enter Canada or will be arrested when they do. Other countries have faced the same issue. For example, France has made it illegal for immigrant families to take their French-born daughters out of the country for circumcision. So if you have a young girl that you bring into the country to begin with, you can take her back out. But any female born in France, it is against the law to have her taken out of the country to have this done. Is it child abuse, or are we taking an ethnocentric view of it? If we make it illegal for Canadian immigrants to obtain the procedure abroad, will they stop doing it? Or will they simply keep doing it, but avoid seeking medical attention when they return if it's needed? Or will it become kind of an underground industry, such as abortion was when it was illegal? We just don't know.